My name is Chris Scott, and I am the president of the ISU Atheist and Agnostic Society, a student club serving the needs of non-religious students since 1999, and I will be your moderator tonight. First, I'd like to thank our sponsors, in addition to the Atheist and Agnostic Society. Also sponsoring the event is the Philosophy and Religious Studies Club and the Committee on Lectures, funded by the GSP. Tonight, we focus on the use of the Bible as a guide to morality. This issue is especially made relevant with the current presidential campaign in which candidates have appealed to the Bible to discuss various issues ranging from abortion to gay rights. So, as part of our educational mission, we organize this event on the question, is the Bible the source of absolute moral rules for today? Mr. Keith Darrell will be arguing in favor of the position, while Dr. Avalos will be arguing against. Before I introduce the debaters more formally, however, let me explain the format and the rules. The format was agreed upon by both debaters prior. Since Mr. Darrell will argue in the affirmative, he will go first. He has 20 minutes to make his introductory presentation, and then Dr. Avalos will follow with his introductory presentation of 20 minutes. Each side will then receive 10 minutes in the first round of rebuttals, 5 minutes for a second round of rebuttals, and finally 5 minutes for closing statements. The debate should end around 8:30, followed by another half hour of question and answer session. During their allotted times, the speakers may ask questions of the other, and then the other side may choose to address or not address these questions during their own time. I will be keeping time, and I will also facilitate the Q&A session afterward. I would like to ask the audience to please refrain from any disruptive expressions of approval or disapproval for either side during the debate, as this will just take time away from the speakers. We'd like the debate to be civil and respectful. Also, please turn off or silence your cell phones or other noise-making devices. Thank you. With that, I will introduce our speakers. Mr. Keith Darrell is founder and an evangelist with the Whitefield Fellowship. Mr. Darrell earned a Master's of Divinity from Covenant Theological Seminary in St. Louis, Missouri. And he has preached on several campuses in many parts of the United States, including our own. And Dr. Hector Avalos is a professor of religious studies at Iowa State University, where he was named Professor of the Year in 1996. Dr. Avalos received his BA in Anthropology from the University of Arizona and Master of Theological Studies from Harvard Divinity School. He has authored or edited 9 books and numerous peer-reviewed journal articles on subjects ranging from science and religion to the history of religious violence. So please please join me in welcoming both of them. Can you hear me? All right. All right. Thank you guys for coming tonight. As we get going, I'd like to thank the Atheist Agnostic Society, the Philosophy and Religious Studies Club, as well as the Committee on Lectures. In particular, I'd like to thank Jeffrey St. Clair, who I met about 1 year ago. I was preaching out in front of the hub, and I finished up and he asked if I wanted to go to some pizza at Jeff's, and we've kind of been friendly since, and so I've appreciated the interaction with the Atheist Agnostic Society over the past year. In the fall, I was here, and Jeff and I started talking about a more formal debate, and I said, well, if you can organize it, I'll show up against whoever. And I wasn't expecting whoever to be necessarily Dr. Avalos, but as Rumsfeld once said, you go to war with what you got, and so that's what we do. So anyway, without further ado, I do also want to thank Dr. Avalos for accepting the debate. In one sense, he's got more to lose than I do. I have zero reputation, aside from being a street preacher. Dr. Avalos, as they rattle off his books and everything else, has academically qualified a bit more in one sense, but in another sense, we'll see if that's the case. I'm also thankful that Dr. Avalos is my debate partner because our positions are truly worlds apart and in total antithesis to one another. This may sound extreme or too strong for some, but consider that Dr. Avalos wants to eliminate religion from human life altogether. He desires a secular humanist hegemony and believes religious pluralism is good so long as it does not interfere with secular humanism's goals. There is a real conflict here and a real necessary debate to be had. So I'm glad that Dr. Avalos, you, and I are here tonight to debate the question, is the Bible the source of absolute moral rules today?
My position is the affirmative, and for some of you this is a scary proposition. When you think of absolutes, for some of you intolerance might come to mind when you think of absolutes. For many, also, if you throw the Bible into the mix, it may conjure up other things in your head, such as scarlet letters. So you may not be thinking that absolutes in the Bible is the best way to go. Yet we must understand that if there are no absolute moral rules or values, then that includes the value of tolerance. Tolerance no longer becomes valuable if there are no absolute moral rules. So rejecting absolutes is not the way forward. The way forward is found in the teachings of Jesus, who says the two great commandments are to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, all of your mind, and all of your strength. And then he says the second is like unto it, to love your neighbor as yourself. It is only here that we can find the truth regarding the world and how to live in it. Tonight, I will seek to demonstrate this in two ways. First, negatively, I will show that Dr. Avalos' secular humanism makes metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, in his own words and by his own standards, unreasonable or meaningless and irrelevant. Second, positively, I will show that Christian theism, which is found in the Scriptures, is the norm for metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Therefore, the Bible is the source of absolute moral rules today. This debate is not about a few Bible verses, but is about two entirely different worldviews. It is about two entirely different metaphysics, two entirely different epistemologies, and two entirely different ethics. Ask yourself, what do I believe exists in this world, and how do I know? What is the nature of reality? That's, in many ways, basically what we're debating. And also ask yourself, how do you know it? Are there any rules in this world beyond social conventions? If so, what are they, and how do you know? This ties into the issue in the history of philosophy that is often known as the descriptive, prescriptive, the is, ought, and the fact-value distinctions. The world of fact, is, and description relates to the things that are. It says, this is a square, that spot is red, or more generally we might say something like, well, that's just the way the world is. Those are all descriptive statements, or statements of fact, or statements of is. The world of value, ought, and prescription is not about the things that are, but how things ought to be. If you've ever said, well, that's not right, or, well, this is good, or the world shouldn't be this way, or that's unjust, those are all kind of value statements. They're prescriptions if you tell someone how to live. Those are all kind of what we're debating. The world of ought is related to the world of norms. The only way to know what we ought to do or how the world should be is through norms. We don't get that through the facts. A norm is a standard or rule, and by its nature it is not physical. It is not of what is, but what ought to be. Are we only in a world of is, or are we in a world of ought? Are there any normative facts in the world? That's really what this debate is about. Is there an objective way to sell this view? Well, I believe there is, and Dr. Avalos suggests there is not. He says, to the extent that other people have the same sympathies regarding, say, values and pain and morality, he says there will always be agreement, or there will be agreement. To the extent that they do not, there will never be agreement. So in one sense, he's saying between Dr. Avalos and I, there'll never be agreement. Now, there's little doubt that there are different subjective sympathies, hence this debate. But Dr. Avalos, certainly you're not here tonight because because you don't believe these can't be settled in an objective way. Hopefully you believe they can be settled in an objective way. We're not merely going to come up here and try to appeal to your sympathies, but rather we're going to set forth a case and not just kind of try to make an issue of us being demagogues, or have it be a football pep rally where you have Iowa State versus Iowa and we're just trying to cheer on our different teams, but rather we're trying to get at truth, and hopefully that's why we're all gathered here tonight. Yet there's also a grain of truth to the idea that sympathies play in. If you have zero sympathy for violating the law of non-contradiction, then obviously there's nothing I can do to change your mind. However, I assume we are here to pursue the truth and to be reasonable. So instead of sympathies, let's examine our worldviews and bring our sympathies in line with the truth, which leads me to my first point. Dr. Avalos' secular humanism makes metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics unreasonable. I will demonstrate this in three ways. His metaphysics is unreasonable because he has no knowledge of anything beyond the sensible. His epistemology is unreasonable because it is self-refuting and destroys normativity. His ethic is unreasonable because there are no ethical facts. How does Dr. Avalos' worldview do this? He divides our world into knowledge and belief. And my 2002 computer. So here's how Dr. Avalos describes knowledge from his book, The End of Biblical Studies. He says, knowledge refers only to those conclusions that have been verified directly by one or more of your five senses and or logic. He adds, we regard fact as coterminous with knowledge. He then says there are reasonable beliefs and unreasonable beliefs. Reasonable beliefs are those that, while not directly verified, are at minimum based on verifiable entities and phenomena. And unreasonable beliefs are those that are not based on any verifiable entities or phenomena. He goes on to define verifiable he says, by verified directly, we mean direct detection of the event, person, place, or thing in question by one or more of the five senses. Furthermore, he states that anything not verified directly is deemed irrelevant and meaningless. Hopefully everyone's following that, and I'll keep that up because it's important to our debate. So one, his metaphysic is unreasonable because he has no knowledge beyond the sensible. Metaphysics seeks to make sense of issues that aren't directly verified by our senses, but those things that actually transcend our senses. As A.J. Ayers says, surely from empirical premises, nothing whatsoever concerning the properties or even the existence of anything super-empirical can legitimately be inferred. Metaphysics is a discussion of the super-empirical, includes things like value and induction. Do you guys believe that there's anything of value in the world as actually in and of itself is objectively valuable? Or do you believe that all value is only relative to your own senses, to your own perceptions? Ludwig Wittgenstein puts the issue nicely. He says, in the world, and keep in mind Ludwig Wittgenstein's not writing as a Christian, so I don't necessarily agree with him, but I think from a non-Christian perspective he's right. In the world, everything is as it is, and happens as it does happen. In it, there is no value, and if there were, it would be of no value. If there is a value which is of value, it must lie outside all happening and being so. For all happening and being so is accidental. There's no plan, no cause, no reason. Everything that's happening in the world is merely accidental. He goes on to say, what makes it non-accidental cannot lie in the world. For otherwise, this would again be accidental. It must lie outside the world. Gottfried Wittgenstein, Dr. Avalos says, that which exists has more value than that which does not exist. But where is he getting this value from, given his epistemology? The problem is that value itself does not objectively exist, does it, Dr. Avalos? If so, where would we go to directly verify something of value? Where do we go to find it? Or is it only in your own sense perception? Another important metaphysical issue is induction. In short, induction is when you take a bunch of particular instances and seek to make a general rule from them. But as Max Born says, no observation or experiment, however extended, can give more than a finite number of repetitions. Therefore, the statement of a law, B depends on A, always transcends experience. Dr. Avalos, you yourself say there is no logical way to justify induction. Don't you say that there is no logical reason why the sun should rise in the east the next time? Dr. Avalos, your whole epistemology is based on this metaphysical truth of induction, but you can't justify its use, can you? I think we can see that Dr. Avalos' epistemology makes metaphysical issues like value and induction irrelevant and meaningless. Two, his epistemology is unreasonable because it is self-refuting and destroys normativity. So how is Dr. Avalos' view of knowledge self-refuting? When he states, knowledge refers only to those conclusions that have been verified directly by one or more of your five senses and or logic. He refutes his own standard because this conclusion has not been verified directly by the senses or logic. Where would we go to find this idea that this is what knowledge is? He can't take us anywhere or bring us anywhere to find out where this place of knowledge is. Therefore, his own definition of knowledge is self-refuting. So Dr. Avalos can't say knowledge refers only to ... because this is an exception to his only. Does that make sense? Therefore, Dr. Avalos' epistemology is irrelevant and meaningless. Similarly, Dr. Avalos' epistemology negates norms. Something that is normative is a rule for conduct or something that ought to be done. Robert Audi states, knowledge is true belief based on the right way, on the right kind of ground. Responding to Audi, Dr. Avalos says, as Audi himself admits, this definition leaves a lot open because it does not really define what the right way or the right kind of ground is. Our definition is explicit, announcing that the right way and right ground is direct verification through the five senses and or logic. What Dr. Avalos says is the right way and the right ground is a normative statement. but the right way and the right ground is not directly verifiable. So if he and Mr. Audi wanted to settle their differences, where would they go to find the right way and the right ground? Dr. Avalos can't bring them into a classroom and show them where it is. He's just kind of working with it. So the right way and the right ground is a normative statement, but the right way and the right ground itself is not directly verifiable. Where have we ever chewed on a norm? Where have we ever chewed or touched or tasted the right way and the right ground? We have not. Finally, his ethics are unreasonable because he negates all ethical facts. Dr. Avalos quotes Thomas Hobbes, "But whatsoever is the object of any man's appetite or desire, that is it, which he, for his part, calls good, and the object of his hate and aversion, evil." Let me bring that up. For these words of good, evil, and contemptible are ever used with relation to the person that uses them, there being nothing simply and absolutely so, nor any common rule of good and evil. After saying that we develop our ethics through self-interest, Dr. Avalos says, Hobbes is right in observing that bad and evil describe nothing more than what is against our individual and our group interest, real or perceived. Think about the implications of this view for a second. If we were up here torturing a child for fun tonight, and maybe some of you, or hopefully all of you, would yell, well, that's evil. But keep in mind, his view of evil is only in relation to your senses. So it's not the actual act itself that's evil, but only into relation to your senses. Therefore, he basically negates all objectivity of morality. Also, morality is that which is directly verifiable. What you ought to do, you can't see what you ought to do. So again, on Dr. Avalos' own grounds, it's irrelevant and meaningless. So that's a basic sketch of Dr. Avalos' worldview, and hopefully we can see, or hopefully we'll think that there has to be a better way forward. Fortunately there is, and it's found in the Scriptures. I will show that Christian theism, which is found in the Christian Bible, is the norm for metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Therefore, the Bible is the source of absolute moral rules today. First, the Christian worldview is not bound by empirical verification as an ultimate norm, which many of you believe is its deadly fault, but as we saw, empirical verification as an ultimate norm is self-refuting. Christian epistemology is based on revelation, and this revelation is not self-refuting. Second, the metaphysics of Christian theism is rooted in the absolute and personal God of Scripture. In saying God is absolute, I'm saying that there is nothing that stands over him, either an unknown realm or a norm. And in saying God is personal, I'm saying he speaks, he acts, and in short, he can be known. So God is an absolute personality who is the source of the world and everything in it, and as the creator and governor of all things, he himself is a source of normativity, be it epistemic or ethical. Any God or being that falls short of being absolute falls short of being meaningful to the world because there is something more ultimate, be it chance or another being, so it cannot be the base for an ultimate norm. Any absolute that falls short of being personal falls short of being meaningful to the world because it is a mere abstraction and cannot provide a norm, because norms deal with obligations and duties, and these are due to persons and not impersonal forces. The fact that God is absolute and personal is central necessity to epistemology and ethics. As philosopher Richard Taylor says, a duty is something that is owed, something that is due, and to be obligated is literally to be bound. But something can be owed only to some person or persons. There can be no such thing as a duty in isolation. The concept of moral obligation is unintelligible apart from the idea of God. The words remain, but their meaning is gone. The absolute personal God, whose name is Yahweh, is the norm. If there are no norms, then there is no knowledge, because you need norms for knowledge. If you have no God, then you have no norms, because norms are due to persons. Dr. Avalos believes he provided a norm, the right way and the right grounds. But we saw it as self-refuting, and at best, the norm is that of an individual finite man, which would place him as under the category of not being absolute. The mind of God, as revealed in the Scriptures and creation, is the right way and the right ground for ultimate epistemic and ethical norms. Since God is the ultimate norm in epistemology and ethics, then his character and his revelation of himself in the Scriptures is a source of absolute moral rules. God's moral character is the source of what is required of us. God is described as holy, holy, holy in Isaiah 6, and the Apostle John says that God is light, and in him there is no darkness. God cannot lie, and God cannot deny himself. Yes, there are things that God cannot do. In this light, we can see that Plato's Euthyphro is no real dilemma, because there is no norm above God, so goodness is not above him, and he cannot deny himself, so it is not arbitrary, but it is his own nature. So he tells us to be holy as he is holy, and he tells us to be perfect as he is perfect. Before Jesus ascended, he said, "All authority under heaven and earth are mine. Therefore make disciples of all nations, teaching them to observe all things I have commanded you." And those commandments are found in love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all your soul, all your mind and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. In the beginning, God made Adam and Eve, giving them one commandment: don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Basically, they were called to trust God and His Word. Yet, despite being in the image of God, so already, in a sense, being like God, man desired autonomy from God, so he desired to be like God in a sinful way. He desired to know good and evil on his own, which is the root of this debate. We are all at the tree of knowledge of good and evil, at the tree of life. And the issue is, will we trust the true God, or will we declare our autonomy from Him, deciding good and evil for ourselves? Our first parents and each and every one of us grasp for equality with God when we decide good and evil on our own. Basically, our first parents were Thomas Hobbes long before Thomas Hobbes denied any ethical norm. Yet, this rebellion did not make them like God, but brought sin, misery, and death to God's good creation. The way the world is not the way it's supposed to be. So when we are confronted with things like war, with death, and with famine, which Darwin tells us is just the way the world is, I can assure you that is not the way the world is supposed to be. It is when man, whom God made upright, goes his own way, denying God as his epistemological and ethical norm, that intellectual and ethical chaos ensues, making all things in the world, in Dr. Avalos' words, irrelevant and meaningless. In summary, norms are necessary for knowledge of the world, but are only meaningful in light of the personal and absolute God of Christianity. Dr. Avalos' worldview destroys all norms, including its own, be it ethical or epistemological. So Dr. Avalos' worldview is necessarily false. The Christian worldview is predicated on the understanding that God is the proper source of norms, be it ethical or epistemological. In light of that, the absolute personal God of Scripture, who revealed Himself as Yahweh, and ultimately, in and through the person Jesus Christ, is the source of epistemological and ethical norms. Therefore, His revelation, the Bible, is a source of absolute moral rules today.
Well, I'd like to thank Mr. Darrell for coming to the debate and to the audience for coming out tonight. Let me start with the question at issue, which is the Bible the source of absolute moral rules for today? We have an agreed upon definition. It is an absolute moral rule, is one that does not change due to time or circumstance. This is in accord with what you find in Deuteronomy 4 verse 2. You must neither add anything to what I command you, nor take away anything from it, but keep the commandments of the Lord your God, with which I am charging you. If you don't add something to a commandment or take away from it, it stays the same. It's indefinitely the same. It is in accord with Deuteronomy 5 verse 29. If only they had such a mind as this, to fear and to keep my commandments always, so that it might go well with them and with their children forever. That would mean, then, that always, if you follow Aristotelian logic, is the opposite of not always. Right? That would mean that something that is wrong 4,000 years ago is wrong today. And a rule that's right 4,000 years ago would be right today by that definition. This is as opposed to relativistic moral rules. Rules that do change because of time or circumstance. Which is in accord with some philosophers like Neil Levy, who also makes the same distinction. Now, what Mr. Darrell has to show is that there are rules in the Bible that do not change due to time or circumstance, regardless of whether I believe in God or not. And those rules are used today. Now, what Mr. Darrell said he would show is more like this. Now we'll see how consistent you are, Mr. Darrell, in your ethics. Because you see, the debate here is not between Mr. Darrell and myself. It is between Mr. Darrell, the moral absolutist, supposedly, and Mr. Darrell, the moral relativist, which he is. This is why Mr. Darrell is wrong. His rules ultimately rest on circular reasoning and faith-based claims that cannot be shown to be other than human judgments. It doesn't matter whether there is a God or not. This should still be the case. And some of the rules he cites, like Matthew 22, 34 to 39, which he cited, do and have changed due to time or circumstance. Some of the rules are contradictory in the Bible, if you follow the principles that are in Matthew 22. And some rules are just too general to apply or are unclear today. So it doesn't really matter whether I believe in God or not. This would still be the case. Let's take a look at circularity. All he ends up saying in his epistemology, his ethical epistemology, is a rule is absolutely right or wrong because it's absolutely right or wrong. He hasn't given us any independent evidence of why that rule should be absolute or why that should be called right or wrong. So it's a circle. It's also human-made as far as we can tell. Because Mr. Darrell has not shown that any rule he thinks is absolute comes from God, which for him is the source of absolute moral rules. Mr. Darrell's basic assumption is something like this. God expresses his moral will to biblical authors who then relay it to Mr. Darrell. But see, what Mr. Darrell is actually doing is more like this. He's trusting his own moral judgment no less than I am, and trusting human biblical authors who say they speak for God. We haven't seen God do anything. We just see people saying God does something or says something. So it's a circle. I believe biblical authors speak for God because I believe biblical authors speak for God. That's all he's saying. No different from Muslims who might say the very same thing. A Muslim could just say, I believe that the author of the Quran speaks for God because I believe the author of the Quran speaks for God. A circle. Even if you follow Aristotelian logic, which I and you share, I think. Yes, Mr. Darrell has pre-selected already who speaks for God. It's Mr. Darrell. In fact, it's very curious that every time people say they have the right opinion on ethics, God seems to agree with them. It's an act of self-deification. Flaw 3, the rules he gave do change and have changed due to time or circumstance. Therefore, they're not absolute by the definition we agreed upon. Take this example. He says the Ten Commandments are examples of absolute rules that apply today. Let's ask, do you want to really follow the Ten Commandments? Do you want to follow the commandments on the Sabbath today? Because this is what it says in Exodus 20. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son, your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and earth, the sea, and all that's in them, but rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Note, the commandment doesn't say you can rest on any day of the week. You can't rest on the first or second. It has to be the seventh, which corresponds to Saturday. Not any other day. It's not Sunday. And this is the penalty for not keeping the Sabbath. Exodus 31:15 says, 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of solemn rest. Whoever does not work, does any work on the Sabbath day, shall be put to death. You want to follow the Ten Commandments today? Are they absolute, Mr. Earl? And of course, from Numbers 15:35, where there was a case of a fellow who did work on the Sabbath day, we know that the penalty is stoning to death. This is what stoning looks like. I could show you a more graphic video, but I won't. This is the most barbaric and savage punishment that one can think of. Would you want to keep that kind of absolute moral rule today, Mr. Earl? See, Walmart alone has 2 million employees. Does Mr. Dell still advocate that we stone people who work on Saturday at local shopping centers, bars, athletic events? Yeah, you can't play football either. And so yes, people are not following the Ten Commandments, and you think they're absolute. In fact, some of you may not like Walmart. I kind of like the greeters. They're very friendly. I like them. I like their smocks. I'm not going to kill them because they work on Saturday to make a living. Law 4, of course, the principles he enunciated can generate opposing moral rules. And even if you and I agree on Aristotelian logic, I can show you that they generate opposing and contradictory moral rules. Take the word jealousy and love. Can you be jealous and loving? Well, according to 1 Corinthians 13:4, one of the passages he cites, love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous. And 1 John 4:8 says, he who does not love does not know God, for God is love. So let's think about it. If God is love and love is not jealous, God cannot be jealous. That's not what it says in Exodus 20 verse 4. I, the Lord, am a jealous God. How can that be? If jealousy is not love and love is not jealousy. You see, biblical law can give you contradictory moral rules. You can be jealous and loving, and you can't be jealous and loving. That's a contradiction in any epistemology, it seems. Law 5, some of the rules he gave are too general and unclear. That's because biblical terms are not always well defined, and biblical terms, even when well defined, may not mean the same thing as English words do today. Let's take a look again at what Mr. Darrell believes. He says Matthew 22:34-39 is the fountainhead of Christian ethics. And 1 Corinthians 13 flows out of that. He repeated that very same passage in his introduction. Well, let's take a look at that. In this passage, Jesus is speaking to his opponents, and one of them says, "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." I'm going to demonstrate to you that loving your neighbor may not mean the same thing for the biblical authors that it means to us and some of you. Because as Jesus states it, he's actually quoting Leviticus 19 verse 18. Where it says, "You shall not take vengeance or bear any grudge against the sons of your own people," meaning fellow Hebrews, "but you shall love your neighbor as yourself." And it is very clear that your neighbor is not everyone. It is your fellow Hebrew. This is brought out by a Hebrew scholar like Harry M. Orlinsky, very well established conclusion about Leviticus 19:18. So either Jesus expanded it to mean everybody, or he changed what it says. And how can loving your neighbor be compatible with Deuteronomy 7? When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are about to enter and occupy, and he clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, and when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must utterly destroy them. Make no covenant with them and show them no mercy. Is that what you mean by loving your neighbor, Mr. Darrell? Do you have the same definition as they do? And can you love your neighbor and enslave them? According to Leviticus 25, you can. As for your male and female slaves whom you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are round about you. And they may be your property. You may bequeath them to your sons after you to inherit the possession forever, like dogs and cats and furniture. Is that loving your neighbor? What about sex slaves? Can you have sex slaves and love your neighbor? Because Numbers 31:17, the Hebrews were commanded to kill every woman who has known man by lying with him. But all the young girls who have not known man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. Now, you can presume that these girls, these children, are not going to go willingly with the abductors and murderers of their parents. They're going to be raped. They're going to be sex slaves. Is this what you mean by loving your neighbor? God apparently has a problem in Mr. Darrell's ethical code with two men who love each other too much, two neighbors of the same sex that might love each other too much. Because consensual sex between members of the same sex will earn you the death penalty. If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination, they shall be put to death. Let's get this straight. If you abduct somebody and have non-consensual sex with them, rape them, it's allowed. But if you have consensual adult sex with a member of the same sex, you're killed. How is that compatible with loving your neighbor? And yes, Jesus didn't always say to love everybody. Luke 14:26 says, whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, even life itself, not a pro-life slogan here, cannot be my disciple. Hate is the opposite of love in Aristotelian logic. Is it to you? And can you love your neighbor and eternally torture them? How about that? Matthew 25:41, Jesus says you can. Then he will say to those at his left hand, depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. And your penalty is going to be to burn eternally for that. Is that loving your neighbor? This is what burning looks like. I have sympathy for people that are in burn units. In your moral code, you would not. You would let them burn eternally, suffer something like that eternally. See, this is things that you might do to people you hate. You might reject them, act jealously toward them, burn them, kill them, and make slaves out of them. If you hate them, that's exactly what you do. But in Mr. Darrell's moral code, that's also things you might do to people you love. You might also reject them, act jealously toward them, burn them, kill them, and make slaves out of them. Seems opposite to me. Seems a contradiction. Can you tell the difference then between hateful applications, as you might call them, or loving applications of these rules? Seems to me that they give you opposite results. Rule of thumb. If the same absolute principle can give you opposite results, then there may be something wrong with the principle, Mr. Darrell. Even if I believe in God. Even Jesus said you should judge morality by results. You will know them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from the thorns or figs from thistles? So every sound tree bears good fruit. But the bad tree bears evil fruit. A sound tree cannot bear evil fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. If you call genocide, infanticide, sexual oppression, abduction of girls bad fruit, then even according to Jesus' own criteria, your principles are from a bad tree. And that's why this Old Covenant, New Covenant will help you. According to Mr. Darrell, we can no longer stone people for working on time because we have a New Covenant which is announced in Hebrews 7:12, among other places. But when there's a change in priesthood, there's necessarily a change in law as well. But you see, the law of loving your neighbor is part of that law. It's in Leviticus. And the Ten Commandments are part of that law. So what are we saying? We're not going to follow them anymore? Which ones are you going to pick and choose then? So yes, if under the Old Covenant only fellow Hebrews are to be loved as neighbors, and the New Covenant everybody, and if you allow stoning on Sabbath for Sabbath violations under the Old Covenant, but you do not now, and if you allow sex slavery under the Old Covenant, but don't anymore, then that is a change. Therefore, Mr. Darrell cannot believe that loving your neighbor is an absolute moral principle, because he agreed that an absolute moral rule is one that does not change due to time or circumstance. If I am wrong, Mr. Darrell, you repeatedly have stated that atheists have a wishy-washy moral code. Let's test the clarity of your moral code. give us a yes or no answer to these questions. Very simple. Is killing children always wrong? Is slavery always a crime against humanity? You should be able to give us a yes or no answer at the start of your rebuttal, if your moral code is that clear and absolute.
That good? Okay, first of all, part of the reason I set up my introduction the way I did is in addressing the aspect of, are we being demagogues? It's one thing for Dr. Avalos to come up here and state, well, X, Y, and Z is wrong, blah, blah, blah. So when he uses language like, when he referred to stoning as being one of the most brutal and savage, blah, 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 like, you have to keep in mind, the reason I went after his worldview is, first of all, those words have no meaning for Dr. Avalos. Keep in mind, like Thomas Hobbes, he agrees it's evil and good are only used in relation to him. So he may not like those things, but it does not make those things necessarily evil or bad in any way. So let's get to, is killing children always wrong? No, I don't believe so. And the reason I don't believe so, for example, I believe abortion is murder. But in the case of the mother, I think it's appropriate to kill the child for the safety of the mother. So no, killing children is not always wrong. Is slavery always a crime against humanity? No. Like, we have slavery in our own society. All you have to do, you can find someone in an orange jumper somewhere and they're called property of the state. So the idea that slavery, I do condemn what we had in the American South, but just to throw out this term like slavery, again, he has to tell me why slavery is actually wrong, which he hasn't done. He asked the question, unless he opposes, so for example, if I came up in here, shot the place up, and the police were taking me away, would everyone protest and say, well, that's a crime against humanity? No, you wouldn't. You would applaud the police. For the last few weeks, we've had a hearing on and on about the Trayvon Martin case, and they need to lock this guy up and get this guy. We've made Zimmerman a slave now. He doesn't eat when he wants. He doesn't go where he wants. He's now a property of the state of Florida. So the idea of slavery in and of itself, no, I don't think is an immoral institution in and of itself. So I can give you an easy answer, no, those aren't always wrong, Dr. Avalos. The other thing that's kind of interesting is when you get to issues like genocide, and these are the sorts of things that make this debate kind of difficult, is you throw out a bunch of things and I have to try to untie these knots. But when it comes to genocide, when the Allies went against the Nazis, where we're all like, whoa, wow, look at those Americans, they're genocidal against the Nazis. No, it's a good thing to stomp out Nazis and Nazism. It's just a good thing to do. So the challenge becomes, are there ethical absolutes in the sense that in all ways and all times we're to honor and glorify God and obey His commandment in all things, which is what I would fundamentally believe is right. I believe God's character is fundamentally right. And I believe that all those who transgress His laws deserve justice. The very nature of justice in many ways, as we see with Zimmerman and stuff like that, is in a sense you have to go against the moral principle. So say we have the death penalty here in Iowa, or even if you oppose the death penalty and want to lock the guy up, you are somehow have to stop the transgression of that law. But suddenly we want to have a problem with God when He He doesn't transgress His own law, but when we transgress His law and He brings about justice. So for example, when you take the Canaanites and everything else, the reason God judged them, He gave them 400 years where their sins filled up, and then He judged them. No, I don't think there's anything wrong with Israelites wiping out the Canaanites any more than I think it's wrong for the Americans to have killed Nazis. I just don't think it's wrong. And he can say, well, then you're no longer an absolutist. But we just disagree. I guess the idea, maybe for my first public debate, I bit off too much on what the absolute definition of an absolute is. But the idea that there's no justice for the violation of absolutes, I think would make my position absolutely ridiculous. So the idea of justice is inherent into my system. So when someone violates a norm, when someone violates the character of God, I believe justice is in order. That doesn't lead to relativism at all. And so far from being a relativist or anything like that, I'm still an absolutist. We may have to qualify our definitions ever so slightly, but I don't. When someone's position changes towards God's character, or one of us changes towards the law, I think it's fine for justice to be brought in. The other thing that was kind of interesting, Dr. Avalos wanted to say that my moral laws are tautological, which in one sense, I feel to make sure they are. But aren't all of our beginning points are absolute. So, for example, in the, when I read from Dr. Avalos, that he says that his epistemology is the right way on the right ground. How would Dr. Avalos go about showing that? If he doesn't if he doesn't demonstrate it by the right way and the right ground, he's saying, well, there's another way to go about doing this. So his epistemology that says this is the right way and the right ground is a tautological. Why is it the right way and the right ground? Well, it's the right way and the right ground. So as a Christian, yes, I freely admit that my beginning point is circular. My ultimate authority is circular. But everybody's ultimate authority is circular. I don't care if you want to be an empiricist like Dr. Avalos or you want to be a rationalist. Ultimately, you have to appeal to what you are. So if you're a rationalist, you have to appeal to that which is rational in order to demonstrate your point. If you're an empiricist, you have to appeal to that which is empirical to prove your point. So all of those are circular. But in another sense, God's law is not circular. So, for example, I believe the commandments come from God. So if you have a child, and you tell that child to eat their peas, why should I eat my peas? Well, my mom said so. That's sufficient grounds for your child to have to eat your peas. You could also say, eat your peas because they'll make you grow healthy. So as a Christian, there's a sense in which I can appeal to the law of God and say, yes, why should we obey God's law? Because God said so. So in one sense, you're like, well, why should we obey God? Well, that's part of the issue tonight. But there's another sense in which I can say, well, because God's law will make us grow healthy. So the idea that it's a mere circular, I think, is a bit misrepresentative of our position, and also, again, doesn't consider the very nature of epistemology and the nature of ultimate norms, which by their very nature are circular. So that point isn't that relevant. Also, the nature of Christian ethics is not autonomous. Yes, we're involved in every judgment we make. So we're not our own gods. So think of Adam and Eve in the garden. That's the very nature of this debate. Adam and Eve are in the garden. You have Adam, Eve, you have God, then you have the serpent. And the serpent says to Eve, hey, you won't really die if you go eat of that tree. And she knew God's commandment. And so when we trust God, it's not, I'm not making myself my own moral judge. As a Christian, when I was 17, 18 years old, I came to repentance. I turned from things I was doing and now live a different way. It wasn't because I woke up one day and said, you know what, I want a new ethical norm, I want a new way. No, I met the living God. And that changed my outlook, it changed my worldview. So the idea that we are our sole judges or anything like that, and God always agrees with us, there's plenty of people who are Christians who can willingly testify that their lives, they came to the Bible not because it merely fit their preconceived notions of right and wrong. So far from it being our own standard or anything like that, it is a standard we get by submission to God. But the other kind of interesting thing, just as kind of a side note, I got 3 minutes, is Dr. Avalos, the way he seeks to construct morality today. He seeks to construct morality in 3 ways. He says verifiable common interest, known causes, and known consequences. But each and every one of these commit the naturalistic fallacy. The naturalistic fallacy is, as I mentioned at the beginning, to go from is to ought. This is what is, therefore we ought to do this. So, for example, on Dr. Avalos' own ground, if he's so upset with genocide and just can't stand it, if the verifiable common interest is genocide, well, lo and behold, go and be genocidal. He has no problem with genocide. If you're a slaveholder and you have enough people on your side, go ahead and hold slaves. He doesn't really care about that. Again, verifiable common interest is our standard and our norm, and so that can very much apply to that which is genocidal, that which is slavery, stoning women, however he wants to dress it up. But as he uses language like that, and it has a good emotional appeal to use language like one of the most heinous things, realize that he's speaking from a vacuum. There is no real heinous things. It's merely the way he uses language to describe certain events. So when he wants to describe these things as heinous, it's actually kind of irrelevant. Also, he says we can get into it by known causes and known consequences is how we can develop morality. But again, these are simply begging the question because he's an empiricist, and he already admitted in his writings on the end of biblical studies that we can't logically know that the sun's going to rise in the east tomorrow. Now, if we can't know that, how in the world are we going to calculate whatever decision it is that we make? So, for example, if you invented the printing press, you invent a computer, whatever it is that you're going to do, how in the world can you know the consequences of that if you don't even know the sun's going to rise tomorrow? So again, when it boils down to, yes, I'm an absolutist. When it comes to things like hell, if you realize the nature of God's holiness, which is the very thing, really what we're at here, the debate is whether God can be just when we've transgressed His laws. And so, as a Christian, since I'm utterly convinced that God is just when we've transgressed His laws, do I think hell's just? Yes. Do I think at points that wiping out the Canaanites is just? Yes. Just as in our own way, in our own times, we do define certain things as, well, throw them away, lock them up forever. We have these ideas because we live in God's world. So we have these analog for these things. such as, in a sense, a judgment, a life sentence, whatever it may be. So we kind of have analogs in our world where we have to stomp out racism, we have to stomp out misogyny, and we want to erase all these things from our life. Now, if we want to erase these things out, why? Are they morally evil? Are they morally wrong? Now, if they are, why is it wrong for God to look at moral evil and say, well, let's wipe it out. Let's wipe it clean. It's simply not. So basically what you're doing is you have the Nazis on one side. I don't want to overstate it, so I'm not saying he's a Nazi. But you have the Nazis on one side, you have the Allies on the other, and you're at a duel. And the Nazis say, we're going to wipe all of them out. The Allies say, we're going to wipe all of them out. The issue becomes, within our worldview, who is right? Who has a transcendental perspective that can look at all those things and say, that actually is evil? The Nazis were committing actual evil. As Christians, we do, I agree, we have the transcendental perspective of what God has said and what we're supposed to do.
I asked Mr. Darrell 2 questions, and he's answered them as it's not always wrong to kill children. And if it's not always wrong to kill children, what is, you know? And slavery, he says, it's not always a crime against humanity. So we should still have it, perhaps, according to your moral code. Is that right? So yes, the first question I ask, is killing children always wrong? The reason I asked it is, of course, because the Bible certainly permits it. 1 Samuel 15:1-3, Samuel, the prophet speaking to Saul the king, said, listen to the words of the Lord. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did in opposing the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt. Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant. Do you believe in killing innocent people as well under your genocidal code? Ox and sheep, camel and donkey, what do they do? Not only is it allowed, it is blessed. You read Psalm 137, where it is talking about the Babylonians, enemies of the Hebrews. It says, O daughter of Babylon, doomed to be destroyed, blessed shall be he who repays you with what you have done to us. Blessed shall be he who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rock. Takes your babies, smashes them against the rock. You believe that killing for fun children is also evil? Do you have any sympathy for these children? They must have had the same kind of nerve endings we do today. In fact, the worship of God involved child sacrifice. He ordered you to kill your children, if you read Ezekiel 20, verse 25. God speaking says, moreover, I gave them statutes that were not good. Now, how can a good God that you say exists give statutes that are not good, Mr. Darrell? Can you explain that? And ordinances by which they could not have life. This is not a pro-life God. And I defiled them through their very gifts in making them offer by fire all their firstborn, that I might horrify them. I did it that they might know I'm the Lord. This is a terroristic God, and all you can say is he's just on the same circular basis you say everything else. This is just because this is just. Yes, luck and kill, according to fundamentalist Christians like Reuben A. Torrey. He said the extermination of the Canaanite children was not only an act of mercy and love to the world at large, it was an act of love and mercy to the children themselves. So would you agree that killing those Canaanite children was an act of love, Mr. Carroll? I would like you to answer that in your next round. So yes, John Levinson of Harvard Divinity School agrees that, yeah, child sacrifice only at a particular stage, rather late in the history of Israel, was child sacrifice branded as counter to the will of Yahweh, and thus ipso facto idolatrous. And Moshe Greenberg, in his commentary on Ezekiel, from Hebrew University in Jerusalem, said the polemic against child sacrifice to Yahweh in Deuteronomy, etc., indicates that at least from the time of the last kings of Judah, it was popularly believed that Yahweh accepted, perhaps even commanded it. The second question was whether slavery was always a crime against humanity. You say no. In fact, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has an opposite ethical viewpoint. Article 4, no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. Yes, and it's as cruel as anything else you've ever seen in the South. he mentions the South as one form of slavery you might not support. I wasn't clear on that. But Exodus 21 says, when a man strikes a slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be punished. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be punished, for the slave is his money. Do you feel any sympathy for people like that, Mr. Gerald? And of course, that includes in the New Testament. 1 Peter 2:18, you who are slaves must accept the authority of your master with all respect. Do what they tell you, not only if they are kind and reasonable, but even if they are cruel. If you follow that advice, slavery would never have gone away. So yes, this is Mr. Darrell on Old Testament ethics. He said, I am unashamed of the Old Testament, but the issue becomes one of application. Application is nothing more than moral double talk. It is a morally relativistic, you're as morally relativistic as I am. Because you are saying that you can change your world depending on time or circumstance. You can kill some people when you want to, kill others, not kill others when you want to. These applications can allow killing infants, abducting girls, etc. It comes down to this. It's okay when my religion does it. It's just not okay when the other religion does it. That's what he's saying. And yes, the Old Covenant and New Covenant only results in pick and choose morality. You pick some of the laws you want to keep from the Old Testament, like against homosexuality. But you're not going to follow the other laws against, for example, food. So yes, see, if Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and if Christ and God are the same, Christ is the same guy who ordered sexual rape, abduction of girls, genocide, infanticide, is the same guy. So how can apologists claim that Christ did not command or allow infanticide? So yes, let's say we don't agree on anything in epistemology or much of anything else. But are you willing, Mr. Darrell, to reject as a moral code a book that at any time commands or allows infanticide and or slavery? Are you willing to do that with me? I'm willing to do it. Are you willing to do that?
There it goes. Okay, let me see if I can tackle these, Dr. Avalos, because, again, he mentioned a couple times sympathies. At the end of the day, our morality is not sympathy. So again, we're not up here to be demagogues. If he wants to say, again, let's give worst case scenario that his description of they're raping these women, which the text doesn't say, it's his conjecture and his interpretation of what's going on. Let's say they have this system of slavery and everything else. Honestly, objectively, as Dr. Avalos says, there is no common rule of good and evil. Why are these things wrong? Why are these things wrong if there is no common rule of good and evil? On Dr. Avalos' worldview, so he comes up here and tries to drum up sympathy, but he hasn't presented any argument of why these things actually violated a norm. Now the issue comes in, he made a statement of killing innocent people. Well, we have two radically different things. Now, from my perspective, given his perspective on there is no such thing as good and evil, but it's all in relation to how we use it, I can define each and every one of you as being guilty and kill you all on his grounds, because he says these were innocent people being killed. As a Christian, I don't think God was killing innocent people. The very nature of the flood, the very nature of the wiping out of the Canaanites, God says the heart of man is only evil continuously. And so God brought his judgment upon those things. Again, it's kind of like going back to the Nazi allies sort of thing. Well, lo and behold, the Nazis killed people on their terms and the allies killed people on their terms. Well, yes, we all do it. The question is always why? Why do we kill somebody? And at the end of the day, if human life has no value, which Dr. Avalos says that his worldview doesn't allow for any value, then we can kill people for any reason that we want. However, God, as the author of life, in Genesis chapter 3, or 2, he puts the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life before them. God's the author of life, and even with Job, he can give it and he can take it away. But in the instances that he brings up, God in no way, shape, or form punishes the innocent. Now, the other thing that he brings up, and to be honest, I'm not that embarrassed by child sacrifice. At the center of Christian religion is a sacrifice of God's only Son. So there's a sense in which I'm not embarrassed at the idea of child sacrifice. Going back to Abraham, he offers up his son. I'm not embarrassed by child sacrifice. And yet there's an analog even in our own culture. If people go to war and they die in war, we talk about their blood buying us freedom. We talk about our soldiers being the very best and the best we have. So in a sense, we offer up our children to die for the cause or whatever it is that we may be it freedom. We value freedom, so we think we offer up people to that sort of thing. So it's always an issue of an analog. Dr. Avalos lives in God's world. So he has these categories that he has to live in. Right now he's in rebellion to God, so he sees certain things happen in the scriptures, and he's projecting upon God because he has, in a sense, has established himself as his own God. Let me see what else he kind of tied in here. Secondly, the idea that we should have some a priori notion of what God should or shouldn't do, I think, is fallacious. So if you're a really God, you wouldn't have done X, Y, and Z. But it goes back, again, from a Christian worldview, since there are moral absolutes, we have violated those absolutes, we deserve judgment. The scripture says the wages of sin is death. It's what each and every one of us deserves. And so the idea of like eternal hell and stuff like that, the only way we can kind of drum up sympathy against it, but at the end of the day, if it's what God does, it's perfectly just. He also brought up the issue of the Quran, which in some regards would be maybe beyond this debate, but I would argue that the Quran is self-refuting. It kind of affirms the Gospels, it affirms the Torah, and then it goes around and rejects it. And also, real quickly, as far as it comes to the Old Covenant to the New Covenant, and even dealing with the Canaanites. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. When Adam and Eve rebelled, it brought corruption upon the earth. God sends a flood, wipes the earth clean. He expelled them from the garden. The Canaanites were in the land of promise, and God expels the wicked out of the land. God promised the same thing to Israel if they were wicked. So what it really boils down to as you look at these judgments throughout Scripture, the question is, does rebellion against God deserve judgment? My position is yes. Dr. Avalos's is no. And that's where we're different. And so until Dr. Avalos can tell me there's some transcendental point of why God, to bring these judgments, is actually wrong, he hasn't told me why they're actually wrong. And so what we have here, we go back to the epistemological issue. Because if they are different, Dr. Avalos, on empirical grounds, has to demonstrate why these pictures of maybe someone's back or someone being stoned is actually wrong. Empirically, why is it wrong? Not because it makes you gross, not because you're grossed out by it, but why is it objectively wrong? And if there is no God, none of those things are objectively wrong. It also ties into slavery. Again, I think we have slavery today. We call them prison systems. Throw a guy with a property on the state, they're owned by the state. So Dr. Avalos, unless he wants to empty all the prisons right now, he endorses slavery. So it's not an issue of, and for those of you who are into abortion, you're not against the killing of children. The difference is, as a Christian, with the Canaanites and the Amalekites, there's an issue of guilt and innocence. Dr. Avalos presumes innocence upon them when in fact they're not.
Mr. Darrell would not join me in repudiating genocide and slavery. So really you're saying that in your moral code, it's really no better than an atheist one. I mean, all the things that you say atheists do are things that you say you can do too. You know, genocide and genocide. I've written a book on slavery in the Bible, in which I challenge the claim that it was Christian ethics and biblical ethics that got rid of slavery. If you look at the time frame, you have to ask, why was slavery abolished between about 1791 and 1900 in Western civilization? It wasn't the Bible. The Bible had been there hundreds, maybe a couple thousand years. Nothing had changed. One of the things that did it was the decline of biblical authority. Biblical criticism arose with the Enlightenment in the 18th century, and abolitionists moved away from using the Bible and towards more humanitarian sympathy arguments and legalistic arguments that seem to have worked much better. In fact, if you follow the trajectory from the Old Testament to the New Testament, it gets worse, slavery. In the Old Testament, you had term limits, 6 years for fellow Hebrews. In the New Testament, you have no term limits for slaves. In the Old Testament, some texts prohibited enslaving fellow Hebrews. In the New Testament, you can enslave a fellow Christian. That expanded the orbit, physically, conceptually, of the magnitude that you can have slavery in. And even Christian reference works will admit, most embarrassing for today's readers of the Bible, the pro-slavery clergymen were holding the more defensible position from the perspective of historical criticism. The passages in the Bible about slavery signal the acceptance of an ancient model of civilization for which patriarchy and subjugation were not merely desirable, but essential. And Martin Knoll, an evangelical scholar, not an atheist, said the North lost the exegetical war. They had the worst of the arguments. The pro-slavery people had the better of the arguments, biblically. Because the truth is, all Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, have the slave master model as a central component. That's why followers call themselves servants of God, slaves of God, and why they refer to their God as Lord, and why in their act of worship they bow their heads and kneel. This is all slave behavior because all of these religions were born between about 700 BCE and 700 CE when the slave master model was predominant in society, and they just transferred it on. In fact, slavery grew with Christianity. In the Roman Empire, 16 to 20% of its population was enslaved. You go to a Christian society like Cuba, at least run by Christians, 90% of the population was enslaved. And absolute numbers too. You had more people enslaved under Christian societies than you ever did in the Roman Empire. And it was Frederick Douglass, the American abolitionist, who knew well that it was Haiti, where non-Christian slaves inspired by African religions overthrew Christian masters to found the first republic in 1791 by former slaves. He said, until Haiti struck for freedom, the conscience of the Christian world slept profoundly over slavery. Where is the love thy neighbor part here? Until Haiti spoke, no Christian nation had given the world an organized effort to abolish slavery. And that brings me to the Whitefield Fellowship, Mr. Darrell. You showed a picture of George Whitefield at the beginning of your presentation. This is named for George Whitefield, an English traveling preacher who worked in America. And he models himself on George Whitefield, is that right? Whitefield advocated slavery. Whitefield lobbied, in fact, for the legalization of slavery in Georgia in 1749 after the colony had outlawed it. This is why. He said, hot countries cannot be cultivated without Negroes. What a flourishing country might Georgia have been had the use of them been permitted years ago. How many white people have been destroyed for want of them? And how many thousands of pounds spent to no purpose at all? So, Mr. Darrell, if you regard slavery as a crime against humanity, or as absolutely wrong, why did you choose an advocate of crimes against humanity to represent your Christian ministry?
Is it on? All right. We'll mention this real quick, then we'll move on. Dr. Avalos and I are clearly equivocating on the term slavery. If you think prisoners in a jail today are free people, then go ahead and believe that, but I believe they're slaves. Exodus chapter 21, verse 16. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death. The idea of stealing people, which we had much in the American South and much of the slave trade, and even today, say the sex trade and stuff like that, is punishable by death under biblical law. So just to keep throwing out the term slavery is in and of itself meaningless. We have to dress this thing up a little bit and exactly define what slavery is. Regarding genocide, again, if you think wiping out Nazis is such a terrible thing, or you think it's an okay thing, then maybe you think genocide's okay in instances. So what we're really doing here is equivocating on our use of language. And it's more of a shell game than it is an actual debate of what is actually right or wrong. But again, he keeps playing the sympathy card. He also mentioned about bringing people into the subjugation. And yet, when I mentioned that Dr. Avalos seeks to have a secular humanist hegemony, which, from a religious standpoint, doesn't sound like a promising future. And anybody who's sought to brought in an atheist regime, be it in China, be it in Soviet Union and stuff like that, it hasn't been that good for the religious people. So to set forward some idea that genocide in the Bible is so evil, or slavery's so evil. Again, we're merely equivocating on our terms, and we're using slavery and we're using genocide radically different. Don't be deceived by that move. But when all is said and done, Dr. Avalos, we have two radically different worldviews. We have a worldview that says man's created by God, and God is the definer of what is right and wrong. And you have Dr. Avalos, who's his own God, who can define anything he wants based upon his sympathies. And that's what his argument's been, sympathy. So he brings up pictures, and I'll freely admit maybe his presentation was pretty clever. But at the end of the day, it was all based upon sympathies. Nothing truly right or wrong. So when he objects to these things, it might emotionally feel good to you or something like that. Or, well, look at that picture that brings out about certain emotions. But remember, it's only defined into relation to us, as he tells us with respect to Thomas Hobbes. So what he's really saying is, these pictures, slavery, genocide, all those things in and of themselves are kind of meaningless. I brought the wrong paper. Oh well, brought the wrong paper up. But let me put it in summary fashion much of what the argument's been tonight. With respect to Dr. Avalos' worldview, which he's argued from, keep in mind he keeps arguing from, that if he is right and all we know is that which is directly verified by our senses, then he refutes his worldview because his worldview is predicated upon ethical and epistemological norms that are not empirically verifiable. Everything he said tonight in different ways is actually meaningless. In turn, I argue that the triune God of Scripture is the epistemological and ethical norm whereby we understand and know truth. Therefore, the Bible, God's revelation of himself to man, is the source of absolute moral rules today. I'm convinced that Dr. Avalos has not set forth anything but a self-refuting norm tonight, and his worldview is able to do no other. His arguments tonight were predicated on the violation of the law of non-contradiction within his own worldview and misunderstanding or misrepresentation of mine. I do think that his use of genocide and slavery is a complete misrepresentation of my worldview. Yet the remedy is not found in pride and self-defense, but in humbling ourselves before God, which is the last and the worst thing humanism thinks we should do. Humanism seeks to exalt man before God, but the Scriptures seeks to humble man before God, and yet, in another sense, exalts man into the presence of God. The Scriptures say, "Have this mind among yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God something to be grasped, but humbled himself to the point of death, even death on a cross." So you and I, when we seek to determine right from wrong on our own, we're actually grasping equality with God. And what we see in the person of Jesus Christ is one who, though being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. Scripture says, "Therefore God has exalted him above all names." This judgment that fell in the flood on the Canaanites and ultimately also on the cross in Jesus Christ is what we all deserve, because we have all exalted ourselves to be equal with God. Yet God has humbled himself to the point of death, even death on a cross. The only hope for humanity is to humble ourselves. The irony of me being here tonight is that I know all the debating in the world can't make you do that. So in light of that, I commit you to the grace and mercy of God.
In case you have not gathered by now, my answer to the question, is the Bible a source of absolute moral rules for today, is no. I used to do what Mr. Darrell did. I used to preach about a decade before he was born. I used to preach on the streets. I used to think that I could save all humanity as well, and all of my neighbors who were not Christians. That was my mission. But you see, when I started to study the Bible, I started to see that there was no evidence that this was of divine origin. And I started to have a problem with killing children and not having any sympathy for them, because they were Canaanites. And I started to have a problem with sexual oppression. This is why Mr. Darrell is still wrong. His rules ultimately rest on circular reason. Even when he talks to this is just, he's just saying this is just because this is just. And faith-based things that cannot be shown to be other than human judgment. He thinks he's accessing God. All we see is Mr. Darrell talking about God. Some rules did change due to time and circumstance. Some rules are contradictory. And some rules are too general. All he is saying is X is right and wrong because X is right and wrong. That's all. How is your moral system any better than an atheist one then? And God won't help you because you just take that circular reasoning one step back. All you're saying is whatever my God says is right and wrong, because whatever my God says is right and wrong. The problem is any non-Christian religion could say the same thing. And how would you differentiate between religions that are all saying whatever my God says is right and wrong, because it is? That's why the Bible won't help you either. You can't verify that anyone, even if you believe in God. Including biblical authors were correct about what God wanted. How did you verify that Romans or Paul or anyone was correct about what God said? You showed us no evidence. We have no one but ourselves to evaluate moral claims. Since all faith claims are equally unverifiable, then we always depend on human beings who tell us they know what God wants. So you're always the judge no matter what. You judge that God is right and wrong. Or you judge that God is right about anything. You have to have a prior conception of right in order to even say God is right. Where did that come from then? And that's why self-described Christians today believe abortion is murder and some don't. Some Christians believe homosexuality is a sin and some don't. Some believe premarital sex is a sin and some don't. Some believe killing in war is murder and some don't. There's no uniform moral code, nor can there be. Because these rules are just too contradictory. They're made by an ancient culture, and we have to get beyond this ancient culture. That's why Mr. Darrell's morality is just an act of self-deification. He sets himself off as God. He speaks for God. He shows us nothing that says God is speaking to him or to any of the biblical authors he cites. All we see are people saying that God said something. We never see God said anything here. Even in this debate, I haven't seen God do anything. And that's why it's dangerous. Since you can never verify that anyone is receiving God's revelation, then human beings who claim to speak for God can become dictators. An example is when you cited yourself, Adolf Hitler. He said the same thing. Hence today I believe that I am acting in accordance with the will of the Almighty Creator. By defending myself against the Jew, I am fighting for the work of the Lord. Now how do you know God wasn't speaking to him? See, but democracy depends on citizens potentially having access to the same basic information in order to make decisions about their destiny. And that's why you must challenge theocrats. Ask them how they know God said anything. Ask them for audio tapes and videotapes of God speaking to them. Yes, a better set of ethics uses known causes and known consequences. Things I know can do things. Or negotiation between individuals and groups about a common good. Ask yourself what laws you would want if you did not know what your future place in life would be. Yes, empathy is a key, because if we are biologically and psychologically constituted to prevent or diminish the suffering of others, and that is one hope for a moral code. But according to you, sympathy should play no role. And the Secular Human Manifesto is one that would express my moral views. You look through that, you'll never see anything about hating parents, raping children, killing homosexuals. That's the stuff you find in your Bible, Mr. Darrell. Why is it that the Secular Humanist Manifesto doesn't say that and your Bible does? So you have to ask yourself, what kind of world do you want to live in? Forget about a peace of mind. What kind of world do you want to live in? Do you want to rely on people's say-so about what an undetectable, invisible being thinks? Or do you want to be able to rely on verifiable evidence about causes and consequences? You be the judge. And by the way, you are welcome to take my Bible classes where you'll hear all sides.